of our households and businesses. The government can influence this around the edges, but ultimately it has to come from our people. And that's where we are.
Okay, if debt is the problem, and we're now, as I said, 4 years into this, there has been some consumer deleveraging that has taken place. At the same time, we've built up our government debt. Where do we stand with the total debt for society in the 4 years?
Well,
relative to income.
Well, total debt, private and governmental, right now is about 350%. The totals have come down from about 10 percentage points. But the mix has changed considerably. The private is coming down, as you said, and the governmental sector is going up. The problem going forward is that we're facing a massive buildup of federal debt. Currently, and there's a lot of different ways to measure federal debt. The old way was to just look at the federal debt owed to the private sector. That doesn't really work anymore for a couple of reasons. Number one, the Fed's not going to be able to hold this debt permanently. And also we've got tremendous unfunded liabilities for Social Security and Medicare, which are not reflected in the debt levels. But so the total debt right now of the government is basically 100%.
Of GDP.
Yeah, in other words, we're facing a debt ceiling here at 14.2 trillion. The GDP is about 15, so technically we're a little bit less than 100%. The CBO is saying in 5 years it's going to be another 5 points higher. The IMF, who has no axe to grind in this, is saying it's going to be 15 points higher. So the federal debt is going to continue moving substantially higher. And the problem is that there are certain forces that are taking over, certain uncontrollable forces. One is the demographics. I mean, right now we're retiring about 3 million people a year, and that's going to continue going up. I mean, and we've not fully funded Social Security and Medicare. I know it's a sacred trust that was made to the retirees or potential retirees, but it wasn't funded. And the second problem that is going to loom increasingly large is that the interest expense, which right now is about 9-10% of total government revenues, by the end of this decade will be 20%, according to the CBO, and in the next decade.
And I presume that's at current interest rates or normalized?
At sustaining current interest rates. That's not assuming a huge increase in market rates of interest. By the end of this decade, interest expense will jump over defense spending. So the top three components of the federal budget by 2020 will be Social Security, Medicare, and interest expense. And so we're moving along a path here where the federal government indebtedness is going to swamp the increases or the reduction in the private sector debt. And our total indebtedness is not going to be paid down. And that's really what we need to do. If you look at the historical record of the debt to GDP going back to the 1870s, after these major events, the railroad panic of 1873, the panic of 1929, the panic of 2007, they were all brought on by this unusual buildup of debt. And the record is quite clear. It takes 20, sometimes 30 years.
And that's without a baby boomer bulge hitting it, right?
Yeah. Now maybe we'll get lucky and there'll be certain technological advances or things that we cannot contemplate that come in and shorten this time frame. But we're facing a very long, difficult road. In the meantime, what we know from these earlier episodes is that increased indebtedness doesn't make us more prosperous. It doesn't increase our options, it reduces our options. I mean, that's the main reason why our standard of living today is where it was in 1995. I mean, we're not generating a better style of living for our people. And unfortunately, I think our people know it. And the root cause is the fact that there is simply just too much debt.
Well, the prime accumulation of debt now, our problem now is sovereign, it's not private debt. And we are just a day removed from Greece having to face a default and made some major adjustments. I think it's an extremely important day, not just for Greece and Europe, but it made the point that for the first time since World War II, a developed country could get to the point where it can't service its debt. So I have several questions that follow that. I guess first of all, what kind of contagion could come out of even the solution, let alone, I can well imagine the kinds of contagion that would come out of a default, much like the subprime mortgage meltdown, but with their attempts to patch up the problem, do you see contagion rippling across the financial markets?
I do, Lou, and I think that your question is very correctly stated. What we have in Greece and in Ireland and in Portugal and in Spain and possibly even Italy. I think Italy's a tougher case to analyze, but we do not have a liquidity problem. Making a bridge loan to Greece of another $20 billion, which is what we've done, doesn't solve the underlying problem. What we have is a situation, let's say we're talking about an individual, and say the individual has $4,000 a month of income, and he's got $8,000 a month of interest expense, and he's got to live. I mean, Greece's debt greatly exceeds their GDP. And so we're making them another loan, which they're going to burn through. We've already made them 2 loans in the last year and a half, all of which were supposed to have solved the problem. So we increase their indebtedness, increase their interest expense. The Greek government has managed to pass austerity bills, but there's no basic support in the country for the legislation. No guarantees that this pledge will be any more successful. And so ultimately what will happen is the insolvency problem will rear its head. And in other words, trying to buy time is not the way to go. What we should have done is written the debt down and forced the banks to accept a longer-term IOU, essentially what Nicholas Brady did back under Bush President 41. Have the banks write down the loan. But the insolvency problems are exacerbated by making additional bridge loans.
So are you at the sense that and I guess the question would be, which countries are we at a tipping point where throwing more short-term bridge financing is just leading to a bigger crash, a bigger problem because we're adding to their debt? So
I think Europe is closer to that point than the United States. And I also think Japan is closer to that point than the United States. Let's talk in terms of the metric that we've been talking about, debt to GDP. Our level is 350%, and we clearly have problems with that. But in the Eurozone alone, debt is 450% of GDP. That's private and public. Germany is in good shape, but you've got, and France almost as good a shape, but the periphery of Europe, real serious problems. This is not on anyone's radar scope, but total debt in the UK is also 450% of GDP. So both the Eurozone and the UK have a debt ratio 100 points higher than in the US. And in Japan, the private and public debt is around 475%. So one of the things that is buying us a little bit of time is that there are other problems in the world that are more serious than our own problems. But that should not give us any comfort that we can avoid dealing with these issues. They need to be dealt with now as soon as possible. Now, what will the end game look like? By the way, I don't think the end game is at hand. I don't know whether it's going to occur in the next 5 years or 10 years or even 20 years. I mean, Japan has been on what is clearly an unstable course, and they've survived, and that's the kind of tricky thing. It's not a crisis until it is a crisis. The trends may be clear to professional economists, but suddenly some small, unusual event occurs, and what appears to be an equilibrium situation deteriorates into chaos.
Well, can't you well imagine that seeing Greece actually getting to that point will affect the expectations in other markets?
I think it has. I think it has, and what it shows us is, let's think about debt in a sort of a practical sense, but also in the sense of a classroom economist. The value of your debt or my debt in the final analysis has to be equal to the discounted present value of our future income, right? We've got to cover it. So in the case of a government, the debt in real terms, and I include the Federal Reserve's debt because the Federal Reserve is an entity of the federal government, has got to equal the present value of federal revenues minus federal expenditures, adjusted for the discount rate. Now, at the point in time that the market loses confidence in those net revenue flows, the present value formula tells you that the discount rate goes up.
And Greece has seen 30%.
And at that point in time, monetary policy is ineffective, fiscal policy is ineffective, the normal economic relationships break down, and then the external factors impose a solution. So if we continue and allow our debt problems to careen out of control, then we're going to head to a situation. It may not be my lifetime, but we're going to be in that situation, and there's no one to bail us out.
I think the problem is telescoping in time. The time
It may
frame.
well be, and that's what we have to be very alert to.
I have a question, and I know of no better person to ask this because we have a fiscal problem which conceivably could create a monetary problem. And let me give this. I always envision in looking for a solution to the debt overhang, obviously at default, well, you don't want to go there. I think you might comment on Fisher's solution, devaluation. But the third one is, and maybe comment on both of these. As I say, I know no better person to ask this question. I keep thinking back to the Civil War. And we were in a similar situation, running large deficits. We didn't have a central bank. Congress gave the Treasury the authority to print U.S. notes, to print money. Well, the United States were up against this August 2nd deadline. In my envisioning and looking at this problem, I thought maybe 5 or 10 years down the road we would get there, but it might be by August. That if we can't any longer issue debt, I could well see Congress passing an act that Treasury can print money. States have done that when they've been having, they call this script. In which case, you'd have two, basically, fiscal and monetary policy are the same. The difference is far more inflationary in the sense that when the Fed prints money, it buys financial instruments. In the second scheme, if the U.S. Treasury printed money, it would be buying goods and services, so it goes right into goods and service markets as opposed to financial markets. Do you see this as a possibility, and what would be the outcome?
It is a possibility. But I think the net result would be the same as what we saw under quantitative easing. Because if they were to go to that policy, there would immediately be speculation in the commodities. And it would run the commodity prices up. And initially, the wages would lag. And so the immediate impact would be contractionary. One of the ways in which I use headline and core inflation, and it's not a way the Fed uses it, is I take the ratio of headline to core. And by the way,
that's interesting. Yeah.
Since the two came into existence, the difference year over year since 1958 is only 0.04%. But when the ratio rises significantly, it's an indication of trouble, of economic contraction, usually a recession. what happened in